Our speaker today is Mike de Souza. Now, he is currently the managing editor of the Canadian Observer? I've got the National Observer, frozen brain here. I was on it this morning, delightful website, and I enjoyed it. He is perhaps best known to me, however, as, and I don't know if I'm allowed to say this in Ottawa today, he's the fellow who found the important conflict of interest in the review of the Energy East pipeline, since terminated. As I say, I don't say that aloud, and I certainly don't say that outside this room. Certainly not in Ottawa, certainly not today. And I hope he'll forgive me and wear his tin shorts as he leaves the building. At any rate, because I will. Because at any rate, the subject is media and climate change, and basically, media, how do they handle climate change? And please excuse if you're thinking that's your alarm. No, it's mine. He's telling me I need to be somewhere else already. It's a bad day for me. So anyway, it's a pleasure to introduce you, Mike, and I will be watching your talk with interest on the web. Because I've got to leave. Thank you.
All right. So I think that we are right now at a pivotal moment for journalism in Canada. It's a pivotal moment for facts, for science, and for the future of the planet. And I know you're here to hear about how the media covers climate change and how we do investigative reporting on this particular issue. The fact that you are all here tells me that you care and that you want to be part of the solution. And I thank you all for coming. I thank the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome for hosting this talk and starting this discussion so that we can all engage and talk about this issue. Journalism, it is a two-way street. It's not only and particularly now, I think, 20 years ago when I started reporting, it was before the age of social media, and we were reporting and we'd get sometimes letters to the editor. I started off in radio, and sometimes there would be calls into the newsroom or people calling in on the talk shows. But right now there's this instant way that people can contact us the moment we publish a story online. So it's important for us not only to report the news, but to listen to what people like you want us to be writing about, what your questions are about how political leaders are making decisions and how these decisions affect your day-to-day lives. It's important that, well, personally, I do this because the work I do as a journalist, because I know and I have developed some of the skills that are needed in terms of being a journalist to uncover secrets and help guide other reporters to do the same thing. So as you heard earlier, I'm managing editor, but at a startup publication, I spend some of my time editing, some of my time reporting. So I think it's important when journalists have skills like this to use them to uncover evidence in a nonpartisan way. And the only people we serve are members of the public just like you. People who understand how human activity has changed the planet, people who understand climate change, and people who understand that prosperity means a world where everyone is informed about the facts and no one is left behind. I think having impartial evidence-based journalism is a key thing. So I guess I could say that I'm biased about one thing, and that is I am biased about my belief that responsible evidence-based journalism is part of the solution to pretty much all the problems we face as a society today. We're trying to build a culture at National Observer right now where there is a large team that gets this and that can deliver this to a mass audience. And one of the reasons we can get to stories like the Energy East story that was mentioned earlier is having an understanding of how governments work. We can get to stories that others often overlook because we understand how decisions are made and the steps that go towards developing decisions or policies in government. I'm not just talking about politicians and the politics of government. And, in fact, I try personally when I'm reporting to stay away from the sound bites that we hear every day, the political back and forth, because I see this as a sideshow that distracts from what we really need to be focused on in terms of real decisions with real consequences. It's not always about politicians and their intentions. Sometimes it's about the public service, what it has been trained to do, what it has been accustomed to do, and how it operates. And I think that any journalist who fails to understand this will have difficulty getting to the bottom of the story and finding out what really happened. So one of the things that I try to stress among our team is that we have to consider this in every story we do in terms of trying to get to the bottom of how a decision was made. We have to find out who is giving the advice, where that advice goes, and ensure that if someone is giving a politician bad advice, that they are also held accountable for doing that. So during the Harper years, I worked before I landed at National Observer. I was in the Post media chain, previously the CanWest chain, writing for the Ottawa Citizen and the National Post, among others. And I used to have a neighbor who worked at Environment Canada who'd once told me, because of my intensive focus on policy that the department was developing, that in a meeting inside behind closed doors, he used to grumble about Mike de Souza trying to tell him how he should run his department at Environment Canada. I heard another story from an academic a few years later that he was recruited to serve for 1 year as an advisor to the then Environment Minister Peter Kent, and he told me on the first day of training, he got this on the job training on his first day about the Access to Information Act, in which he was specifically given instructions about how to avoid writing something that might wind up in a Mike de Souza article. So we use access to information as one of the important tools to get the facts and to find out what is actually going on behind the scenes. And through this, we can get beyond those sound bites. I think one of the things that drew me, getting into the area of climate change and environment, when I arrived in Ottawa in 2005, I'd actually moved here from Quebec City, and my expertise at the time was covering federal-provincial relations, the Quebec's national question, and at the time, Quebec was just getting out of a sovereignist government. And so I was mainly focused on those federal-provincial issues, but I got an interest in the environmental issues soon after the Harper government was elected, after a scientist named Mark Tushingham from Environment Canada. He's not in the room, is he? Is he? He wrote a piece of fiction book called Hotter Than Hell. And he was about to give a talk in I think at Ottawa at the Press Club in the spring of 2006 to talk about his book, a fiction book that was based on what he knew as a climate scientist. And a few moments before going to deliver that speech, he got a call from the department telling him, "No, you're not allowed to speak about your book. We're going to be muzzling you because you're talking about climate change and the government doesn't want anyone to be talking about this topic." That was the first instance of a scientist being muzzled, and that sent a message to me as a journalist that if you have a government that doesn't want the public to talk about a certain topic or hear about it, then it is my job to make sure that the public hears about that and reads about it and asks the government questions about it. So from that day on, I had this almost obsession, you could say, with finding out exactly what kind of advice the government was getting on climate change, what it was thinking on it, and what it was doing. And so moving on to National Observer, it was mentioned the Energy East story. When we do stories like this, we of course face obstacles. There's always people who try to stop us from pursuing the truth or from reporting on it or getting answers. Soon after, or about a month after, we reported on the conflict of interest at the National Energy Board, and this was related to members of the independent panel who were reviewing the Energy East pipeline. They had met privately with a representative of the company proposing the pipeline. Now, the NEB, the National Energy Board, is an independent panel. It's like a court, a federal court. It has the powers of a federal court. So for a judge to meet behind closed doors with one of the parties, of course, is inappropriate, and this is what led to the shutdown of the hearings. And this all emerged from, I lived in Calgary in 2015 and worked for Reuters at that time, and had cultivated some relationships with people who worked at the National Energy Board, and they gave me some of the tips that led me to put in the access to information requests that uncovered the existence of that inappropriate meeting. But after these stories came out, the National Energy Board went out and issued a sole source contract to a private investigator, giving them $25,000 to try to find out who my sources were. This, is one of the, sort of unfortunate obstacles that we would face, and it makes it difficult and harder for us to pursue our work when we know that people are at risk. It requires us to be very cautious with how we handle confidential information, and do everything possible to get the story out while also protecting the people that are risking their careers to come forward and denounce something inappropriate or blow the whistle. So, I would say that this, a lot of what we do is about the public servants who work behind the scenes. Sometimes they are professional and do their jobs. Sometimes they don't. And I want to make sure that, everything that we do at National Observer, it lifts the curtain on both of these possibilities, whether the public servants are doing their jobs or not. Because the inner workings of government is truly a maze, and it takes special skills to solve the puzzles that allow someone to either find the treasures, the smoking gun, if you will, and this is the path to getting the truth, which is our objective in terms of what we're doing for our audience. This is the only way to find out how decisions are made, and this is the only way to hold the powerful to account. It's the only way to identify which people are allowed into the deputy minister's office or the minister's office to lobby them and influence decisions that can affect a city, a province, a country, or the entire planet. I want to go into a few different stories that I've worked on at National Observer, but first I'll just talk about the issue that's been in the news in the past week here in Ottawa about SNC-Lavalin and whether or not, so this was done by the Globe and Mail, primarily investigative journalism, that looked at whether there was undue influence on a process, which is quite similar to the Energy East story that I wrote about, as well as what happened in the case of the review of the Trans Mountain pipeline. When the Trans Mountain pipeline was approved, that review should have been independent and should have followed a legal process, and particularly Section 35 of the Constitution, which is the section of the Constitution that protects the rights of Indigenous people in Canada. Now, in our reporting, we found out that there were inappropriate instructions, a directive. In the case of SNC-Lavalin, it's not clear whether the government has denied there was a directive, and they're talking about pressure, perhaps, or a rigorous debate, I think is the term they used. In the case of Trans Mountain, we did prove that there was a directive to violate the Constitution. So, in my opinion, this area was more serious than what we're looking at right now in terms of the evidence that we've seen about the SNC-Lavalin case. This directive, it was issued behind closed doors. It required people to come forward and blow the whistle. But I want to walk you through the steps of how how we got to this, how we uncovered this information. One day after the Trudeau government announced that it was approving the Trans Mountain Pipeline, this was in November 2016, I had known that there was some debate within government, at least within the public service, in terms of the people who were having conversations with the policymakers. There were scientists who had sent a letter to the Prime Minister a few weeks before he approved the pipeline, warning him of the scientific inadequacies of the review, or deficiencies in the review that the government had undertaken to that point, and the need for more research, particularly on the impacts of bitumen, the product that would have been shipped on that oil pipeline from Alberta to the coast, and what happens to that bitumen when it goes into the water or into the ocean. So one day after the decision came down that was confirming the government was approving the project in a very rigorous and detailed way, I prepared a list of access to information requests that would target specific departments and go after key information that would have been drafted, that I know based on my knowledge of how government works, that would have been drafted in preparation of the government's decision. I spoke to the group of scientists that had been in contact with the government and briefed me on their letter to the Prime Minister, and they told me about who their key contact was in government. So I was able to target that person in government with specific access to information requests to get at the information that he had reviewed or seen and shared, and the advice that he gave. So in the spring of 2017, I got an initial list of collection of emails showing that as soon as that letter came into the Prime Minister's office, there was an army of public servants that immediately went on the offensive, trying to find ways to undermine what the scientists were saying. And instead of, they had presented work that was from a peer-reviewed paper that showed the government was on the wrong track, but instead of reviewing, accepting the science, their first instinct was to deny the science and get their staff to find excuses to reject the science that was right in front of them. About a year later, we got another collection of briefing notes that had indicated the problems in terms of consultations with First Nations. From that, we were able to derive a list of different people who had attended a meeting in October 2016, about a month before the decision was made. And from that list of about 15 people, calling them one by one, we were able to find people who were in that meeting and could tell us that they did get a directive, find a way to approve this pipeline, even though we're still supposed to be consulting with First Nations in a meaningful way. And we're telling the First Nations we haven't made a decision, but the truth is we have made a decision, and you have to find a legal way to get that approved. So those were the steps we went through. It took time, it took persistence, and months of work to really come up with a collection of stories that later, the Federal Court of Appeal reviewed all these articles because of all of the First Nations involved in the legal challenge. They took our work and they had actually tried to get the Federal Court of Appeal, which was doing a judicial review of the government's decision based on the challenge that was launched by the First Nations in some cities. So they read all of our reporting a few months before they came down with the decision in August to say that no, the government hadn't meaningfully consulted First Nations, number one. Number two, they also found that the National Energy Board had made a critical error in its review of the science. So things that we reported on, we can't make a direct link and say for sure because they didn't cite our reporting in their decision, and they actually officially said that they couldn't consider it because it was submitted after the hearings had concluded. But we know that all the justices on the Federal Court of Appeal read those stories, and then they came to the decision or conclusion that no, the government hadn't done its job, and it quashed the approval and sent the government back to the drawing board, forcing it to re-engage with First Nations and to do a second review, which is still ongoing right now. It's led to a bunch of other things, as you know. The decision now is under review, and I would say directly because of the reporting that we did, the government has been forced to admit yeah, we did a bad job of consulting First Nations, and now we have to do that in a correct way. Whether or not they are doing it in a correct way, I mean, I'm still looking into this, and I'm still hearing stories from sources about what the government is doing. So stay tuned. We'll see whether the government truly means what it is saying publicly and is going to correct the mistakes it's made. In that time, the government, well, we know that our reporting might have contributed also to chasing away Kinder Morgan out of this project, that it sold the project to the federal government. The government bought the project, and some of our reporting also looked at what went on behind the scenes in the negotiations that ultimately led to 5 different Kinder Morgan executives getting millions of dollars in bonuses and stock options after that sale was completed. This kind of reporting, it was done first by National Observer. Some other media outlets did it, but it took us looking through financial statements, disclosures to the Securities and Exchange Commission to find out all of these details, as well as access to information requests. So let me ask you to imagine a future where all of Canada's newspapers, TV, radio, and online news outlets have decided to stop reporting on climate change. What if the only source of information you had was an extremist far-right website? Do you think that is conceivable in the near future? Is it? Well, it's happened here in Canada. To a certain extent, I was telling the story to some of the people at my table earlier that the last international reporting trip I did was in November 2017. I went to the climate change summit, the International UN Climate Summit in Bonn, Germany. I was the only Canadian-based reporter covering international climate change talks in Bonn, Germany that year. The only other coverage Canadians were getting was from someone who was peddling conspiracy theories outside of the conference, and that was Rebel Media. They went out there to do stories about questioning the science of climate change and videos. And so that was the only coverage. If Canadians wanted a Canadian there covering that issue, well, they only had National Observer, or their alternative was skepticism about climate change. And why was it significant for us to be there? We know right now that the Canadian economy, it depends heavily on the oil and gas sector. It's responsible, linked either directly or indirectly to more than 100,000 jobs across the country. So if we're going to succeed in stabilizing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and if Canada is doing its part, as most of you know and probably realize in this room, the energy industry in Canada will have to be radically different in the future if we're going to be part of the solution on climate change. Shutting it down overnight is probably not the solution. So it requires a transition that allows people to be trained and moved on to new jobs. Now, the Trudeau government had made a promise to study this issue and propose solutions, at least in terms of some fossil fuels, in terms of coal and moving us off coal, but it had been dragging its feet on the matter leading up to that Bonn conference. So when it was preparing a big announcement, and some of you might recall that it was at the Bonn summit that the federal government and Catherine McKenna officially launched the Powering Past Coal coalition of countries that had all committed to phasing out coal. But the night before it was going to make this big announcement, Canadian Labour Union representatives who were part of the Canadian delegation, they were upset that the government hadn't come up or done anything concrete to move forward on developing a just transition plan. And so they were threatening to walk out. Now, because I was there, the union leaders knew I was there, talked to me about it, and I, interviewed them. I did a story. I went to the government for comment, but there was this big headline that was spreading across Canada that day saying that labor unions are fed up with the government. They're threatening to walk out because they believe that the government hasn't done anything to work towards a just transition solution. We published a story. Overnight, things changed. I am told that there were calls from the PMO to the minister's office. A lot of the chief of staff of McKenna, I don't think got any sleep that night, and was in negotiations. He talked to the union, and then they made a firm commitment to study the issue, to create a task force that would be specifically designed to give the government advice about how to move forward. Don't forget on this issue, the former Harper government actually introduced regulations to reduce carbon pollution from coal plants, but never designed any kind of transition plan to go along with it to protect jobs in the economy. So this is a long-standing issue where, policy is developed, but only part of the policy. And if you truly need to have the full solution, you have to look at that labor issue. And right now, the big question is whether the Trudeau government is doing this for the oil and gas industry. And this is an issue we ask them about constantly, and they don't want to answer the question. They're almost afraid. Ever since at a town hall, I think it was in Cornwall, where Trudeau had made a comment about eventually the oil sands will be phased out. And after that, they were so afraid, I think, politically about the blowback they got about stating something that is, quite frankly, reality, that this industry worldwide will eventually be phased out unless there is some magical technology that we can develop to capture GHGs straight out of the atmosphere. So right now it looks like we're moving towards clean energy. And so we have a situation where there is a need for journalists to press the governments and ask them about this every day, and ask opposition parties as well, what is your transition plan and what are you doing to protect the economy in the future? Right now we have a situation, there was an allusion to these guys with yellow vests who are, I think the CBC might have reported there's 200 of them, but we did a count yesterday and found I think only about 50. And they're not really just pro-pipeline, they're anti-immigrant. There's white nationalists that are part of this group that is on Parliament Hill right now. But the underlying what they're tying themselves to is an environmental protection law that is currently before Parliament, Bill C-69, that is seeking to reverse a number of changes that were brought in 2012 by the Harper government. Now, these changes by the Harper government dramatically reduce federal oversight of major projects, particularly pipelines. When I was at Postmedia, some of you might know if you were reading the Ottawa Citizen at the time, that I had gotten a copy of a memo that was sent to that. I think it was the same deputy minister at Environment Canada who was complaining about me behind closed doors. But in that memo, he was saying that pipelines were quote-unquote top of mind in the Harper government's omnibus budget bill in 2012. It was all part of a sophisticated strategy that had been launched that year to demonize environmentalists and and also investigate them, get them to undergo audits by the CRA and get new projects approved while attacking the environmentalists. We're working on a story right now that looks at all of the holes in this current environmental protection regime. There was actually some research published last week in the journal Environmental Reviews that had analyzed 30 different scientific assessments of oil sands projects and found that each assessment was marred by inconsistent science that wasn't necessarily independently reviewed. So we're working on an investigation right now, a National Observer, that looks at a bunch of different case studies like this in which supposedly independent researchers are asked to manipulate their work to downplay the impact of new projects when they undergo an environmental review. These are facts that are largely missing right now from the debate, which has to stop, which has some people arguing, like the people who are on Parliament Hill today, that the latest legislation will stop all new pipelines. And from what we have seen based on the evidence, is that this new legislation is only a very small step, perhaps, towards improving a very flawed process. There needs to be a lot more. If you talk to someone like Elizabeth May, she believes that this legislation should be rejected because it really is not correcting the things that it needs to correct. So we're looking right now at whether the government is considering evidence and federal regulators are considering evidence when they review projects to prevent bad things from happening, not to stop projects, but to make sure if we're going ahead with them that they're done in the right way that doesn't cause more long-term damage than any convenience or any improvements or benefits. Advertising has long been an issue that I keep track of. There are powerful organizations that come up with, I would say, very sophisticated campaigns to convince people that the problems that scientists say we face as a society are not as serious as what the scientists say. We have seen a number of situations that reflect what is going on behind the scenes in these campaigns. We're working on one story right now involving some very powerful interests in the oil patch that are sponsoring a campaign to convince Canadians that fighting climate change is quote unquote a losing battle. So this campaign involves a strategy to target and recruit prominent conservative-leaning politicians, as well as a think tank to create this narrative and this message that we can't really do anything positive. If we do anything, it's going to harm the economy. And it follows a pattern of many different stealth campaigns. The New York Times reported on a very similar one in the U.S. against the clean car rules, the rules to reduce emissions from new cars, in which it was essentially sponsored by the oil patch to stop an improvement of the regulations that are cracking down on the pollutions. So they're designed to change your mind without you actually realizing that your mind is being changed. But there are so many pieces to these sorts of complex strategies, and it takes a lot of time for journalists to unravel exactly what is going on behind the scenes. Last year we reported on how the main oil patch lobby group in Canada, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, was running advertising in Ontario during the last Ontario election campaign with a message that was questioning whether Canada was, quote unquote, open for business. This was a slogan that was often repeated by Doug Ford during the Ontario campaign, in which he was repeatedly saying, elect me and I'll put up big neon signs saying Ontario is open for business. So, whatever your politics are, when you have special interest or a third party that is advertising and perhaps inserting itself into a debate, well, I think you need to know about it, and at least then you can make informed choices. We've also been tracking the rise of an influential group on social media channels called Canada's Energy Citizens. This is essentially a public relations arm of, again, that same oil patch lobby group, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. They run it. It now has more than 250,000 followers, and it feeds its audience a very narrow view of the important issues facing Canada today, with little attention paid to, in all of these campaigns and all of these strategies, they never look at the devastating economic consequences that have been identified by scientists that we will face if we do nothing. So the work that we're doing at National Observer, it is to make sure that people get a complete picture. For those of you who weren't familiar today, I think we've been circulating the sign-up sheet. If you want to get on our mailing list for our daily newsletter, please do sign up. I'm happy to answer any questions that you send me after today, and follow up and engage with you on what we can do, how we can do it, how we can do better. Again, access to National Observer is free, but to a certain extent. At some point, we do ask you to subscribe after hitting a certain number of articles a month. So if you have that capacity, please do consider subscribing, and that'll help us do more of the work that we're trying to do. I always like to say that investigative journalism is not something that can be deployed like a SWAT team in an emergency situation. It is an ongoing process that requires patience, persistence, and hard work. So on that, thank you again for coming, for listening to me, and I'm happy to answer questions and or engage in discussion.